Hi, I'm Susan Glenn. I'm going to be talking about the distribution of biomes across the planet in this chapter on life on land. This is from the textbook Ecology, Concepts and Application, which was written by Molles and Sher. It's a McGraw-Hill publication from 2019, so it's the 8th edition of this book. And this is a big chapter in the book because it is covering all the biomes in detail. And so I've divided up the presentation into two parts. This particular part, I'm going to be talking about the large-scale patterns of how the climate varies across the planet. I'm going to talk about other factors other than climate that are influential in shaping where we find the biomes. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the finer scale variation of climate over time. I will introduce the concept of the biomes, but then a second presentation is going to be going into detail on each individual biome. So, uh, the first section of your textbook introduces the concept of the biome by talking about a biome that you're probably quite familiar with, and that's this yellow area. This is the desert biome. So you think about the Sahara Desert across northern Africa, in the Middle East. We've got the Great Desert in the center of Australia. And when you think of deserts, you think of these broad wastelands with hardly anything living there. And yet there are a lot of different species that are living in the deserts. It's still distinguished by its predominant plants. And it's one of the biomes you can probably list in your head when you're thinking about the different biomes. You got deserts, you got tropical rainforests, you've got the Arctic tundra. So you could probably think of several biomes straight off before you even started reading the chapter. And we're going to be talking about the natural history of these biomes, which is really the study of how organisms in an area are influenced by various factors, which include climate, soils. Those are the major ones we'll be talking about. But it can also, natural history could be studying the influence of predators and competitors and other things in the environment. And so when we look at this map of the global distribution of the biomes, we can see a list of biomes in your textbook that are covered here. However, different books, different classification systems will separate different types of biomes. Some will simplify things, so these tropical dry forests and these tropical rainforests. For some textbooks, we'll just put that together in a tropical forest category. So it really does depend on the particular classification as to how the different biomes are actually distinguished from one another. In trying to understand where we find particular biomes, the climate is the most important factor to consider. The climate will determine what kind of plants are growing in a particular place because of the impact of the temperature, whether it's freezing, whether it's very hot, and the water availability. When you think of a biome such as the desert, we have very low water availability, although deserts can be found in a variety of different temperatures. So regardless of the continent, the desert has plants that have certain functional traits that allow them to live within that particular combination of low precipitation. And this arises through an evolutionary process so that the plants that actually have a waxy coating that keeps water from evaporating out of them during the middle of the day, those ones are going to survive and be able to produce more offspring and live in the desert compared to a plant that doesn't have a waxy coating. Or a plant that has little spikes that keep something from eating it is more likely to survive in the desert because the animals are trying to get the moisture out of the plant. And the ones that don't have the little spikes spikes are less likely to survive and reproduce. This graph shows you how the biomes are related to temperature and precipitation. So when we look at this graph, we can see across the x-axis we have the average annual temperature, and up the y-axis we have the average annual precipitation. So the temperature is varying from minus 15 Celsius to the freezing point at 0 Celsius. Over to the right, it goes up to 30 degrees Celsius as an average annual temperature. The precipitation at the bottom of the y-axis starts with no precipitation up to 50 centimeters precipitation. You can see we have the deserts in that particular range. And it goes all the way up the y-axis up to between 450 to 500 centimeters precipitation, which is 4.5 to 5 meters precipitation on average every year. So what he did was he looked at each particular location on those two axes, and each little blue dot on this particular diagram clustered up in the corner, each little individual dot shows you a location. And then he drew boundaries around where you would find the grassland biome. These were the dots of the grassland biome. These were the dots where the desert biome was, and able to come up with this particular graph. Now you can see the boundaries between those biomes when you graph them, they overlap. So you might have some areas where you have a tropical dry forest with this amount of temperature and precipitation, and other areas of overlap where you would have the same temperature and precipitation, but you'd have a temperate grassland. And this will depend on other factors. So it's not simply defined by precipitation and temperature, but those do explain a lot of why you find the biomes where you find them. Now, when we think about temperature and precipitation, those are going to influence the plants, and the plants are the primary producers that are going to be the food and the habitat for the rest of the ecosystem. And so what is affecting the plants is going to affect everything. And that's why the plants, the primary producers, are usually characteristic of that particular biome. Consumers are considered to be secondary, so a second trophic level, a feeding level. Consumers, something like a animal or a fungus or a bacteria, they can also be directly impacted by the climate, but they can also be indirectly impacted because the climate is affecting the plants, and that is their food source. And so you can see that often it can be an indirect impact. And just a little reminder, when we're looking at energy moving through an ecosystem, we can see the energy from the sun is going into the plants. Those are your primary producers. And then they are eaten by the secondary producers, which are called the consumers. So we have the herbivores, the carnivores, we've got secondary carnivores that are eating primary carnivores, and then we have the detritivores and decomposers. Now, we like to think of the biomes as being something stable, something that's always the same, but we know that they do change. Species come and go, things happen. We see this now with climate change. We're seeing a lot of changes in a lot of the biomes. This is an example of the national tree of Costa Rica. This is the monkey ear tree or the elephant ear tree. It's a nice big shade tree, and they were finding that they were having difficulty keeping this tree going, that the seeds were not germinating from this tree. When they looked at the natural history of this tree and the seeds and what was happening, is that normally the tree will drop its seeds down onto the ground, and it's too shady right under the tree. And so in the past, they were eaten by seed dispersers. So the seeds were eaten by something that was somewhat like a camel that lived in that area thousands of years ago, and they would then eat the seeds that had fallen under the tree, and when they walked away, they could, in their feces, disperse the seeds onto the ground in a pile of nice, healthy, fertile manure, and the next tree could grow up in that spot. once they understood that natural history, then in the national park in Costa Rica, they were able to reintroduce, or not reintroduce, but introduce domestic seed dispersers. So they could take domesticated horses and cattle, and they could eat the seeds. So you can see them eating the seeds here. And then when they wandered around, they could defecate and the little seedlings would be in the dung and able to grow. So we know that understanding the natural history helps us understand how these biomes work. And this is where natural history is key to understanding a lot of how to help and protect the biomes. So here we used it to solve a particular problem. Now we're going to talk about the large-scale patterns in climatic variation, and this will help us understand why we find the biomes, where we find the biomes. The sun heats up some parts of the earth much more intensely than other parts of the earth, so we can have some very predictable variations. We also have the earth is on an angle. The axis is not straight up and down, but it's tilted at 23.5 degrees. And so that also adds a certain amount of variation that we call the seasons into our climate. So we have variation depending on the latitude, so we can go from latitudes around the equator where we're at 0 latitude up to a latitude of 90 degrees at the North Pole and 90 degrees down here at the South Pole. So we have getting cooler as we go up and down from the equator, but then we also have seasonal variability. Temperatures are usually pretty constant in the equatorial regions, so there's less variability around the equator, whereas obviously you have more temperature variability as you go towards the north or south poles. But the rainfall can be very seasonal in the equatorial regions. Overall, we know that deserts are going to receive little precipitation, so if we can understand where precipitation falls and where it doesn't fall, we might be able to predict where we would find the deserts. So because the Earth is a sphere, then we have unequal heating because of the shape of the Earth. And also because it's on an angle, some parts of the Earth are going to be getting more direct heat than others. So the sun's rays are more concentrated when the sun is directly overhead. So if we're looking at the Earth, and it's tilted, and we've got the sun over here, shining on. If it's directly overhead, then you're going to have all the sun rays concentrated on that one spot. If it's not directly overhead, if we, in the winter we look and we see that it's kind of low on the horizon in the sky, then we can see those same sun rays are spread out over a larger area, and so you have less concentrated heat hitting the surface. So the latitude where the sun is directly overhead is also going to change because of the tilt of the axis of the Earth. So sometimes the southern hemisphere has the sun directly overhead, and other times the northern hemisphere, north of the equator, has the sun directly overhead. The tilt of the axis is 23.5 degrees from perpendicular. So that means if we had the axis was at 90 degrees, it's just been tilted off 23.5 degrees from straight up and down. The YouTube site SciShow has some great videos. I highly recommend taking a look at all their different channels. And I think they did a really good job with their animation showing you how, because of the tilt of the Earth, at certain points of the year, you have more direct sunlight reaching an area than you do at other times of the year. So we can see here in the Northern Hemisphere in the summertime, we can see the Northern Hemisphere is facing the sun more directly, so it's getting much more direct sun rays on the Northern Hemisphere, whereas they're going to be more spread out in the Southern Hemisphere. In our winter time, you can see the rays coming off of the sun are going to be spread out over a larger area, so they're going to be much cooler than if you're down in the hemisphere. They're going to be much more concentrated. So on the first day of winter, this is when you can see that the sun is going to be directly overhead this point on the southern hemisphere. This first day of winter is going to be their first day of summer. And on the first day of summer in the southern hemisphere, the sun is directly overhead the point that is at the latitude 23.5 degrees south is going to be where the sun is directly overhead. And that latitude is called the Tropic of Capricorn. Our first day of summer is when the sun is directly overhead 23.5 degrees north, which is the Tropic of Cancer. So the Tropic of Cancer is at 23.5 degrees north. The Tropic of Capricorn is at 23.5 degrees south. The first day of what we would call fall, so we're going from, we would call fall, so we're going from summer towards winter. We're right in this spot. The sun is directly overhead the equator, which is 0 degrees latitude. And then the first day of spring, the sun is once again directly overhead the equator, which is 0 degrees latitude. When the sun is directly overhead the equator, everyone on the planet, no matter where they are, have 12 hours of daylight on the first day of spring and 12 hours of daylight on the first day of fall. And that doesn't matter where you live on the planet, you're going to have 12 hours. But it doesn't mean it's going to be the same temperature everywhere, because obviously it's much more concentrated over the equator than elsewhere. So when we're going from season to season, we can see where the sun is directly overhead will vary at different spots on the Earth. So it's going to be moving from being directly overhead the equator to being directly overhead the Tropic of Cancer, then directly overhead the equator, and then directly overhead the Tropic of Capricorn. So these changes in where the sun is are going to result in changes in temperatures in different places. And changes in temperatures is going to cause changes to the air. When you think about air warming up, the air is going to expand when it warms up. All those little molecules of air, as it heats up, they're going to start moving faster. And they're going to, when they move faster, when they've heated up, they're going to push each other further apart. And so the air will expand with the heat. So as the air is expanding with heat, you can imagine then it's moving. It's going to push it out from one place to another. So that is what's going to cause your wind and your atmospheric circulation. Also, as it heats up, there's more room in between these molecules to put a water molecule. And when you're doing that, that's going to mean that the air can hold more moisture. And then if it goes somewhere where it cools down, those far apart water molecules will move or air molecules will move closer together, and your water is going to condense to make your clouds, and it'll start to rain. So, because of the shape of the Earth being a sphere and the tilt of the axis, it causes uneven heating. This drives the air circulation patterns, which we call Hadley cells, and that's going to influence where precipitation falls. Remember, where some precipitation falls, you might get a tropical rainforest. If there's no precipitation falling, you may be able to get a desert in that area. We know that warm, moist air rises. Then it's going to, as it rises, as you move away from the surface of the Earth, the air is getting thinner, it's much cooler. Then when it's cooler, then those water droplets are going to condense into clouds and fall as rain. That cooler, drier air then is going to be heavier because it's cooler, it's more condensed, and it's going to sink back to the surface. So you're going to have cool, dry air coming to the surface, dry air, desert. So because of that, rainforests are going to be found near the equator. Near the equator is where this warm air is rising, full of precipitation. As it gets up high, it's going to cool, condense, and fall as rain. But there's still more warm air rising that's going to force the cooler air to go north and south of the equator, and you find major deserts near 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. So let me just draw a little diagram. Here's the surface of the Earth. Up here in the sky, we have the sun. Maybe make that redder so you can see it. And so as the sun's rays are coming down onto the surface of the Earth, we can see the air is going to start heating up, and it's going to push the molecules further apart so it becomes less dense, and that warm air is going to start to rise. With it, it's evaporating the water in it, so we're holding lots of water in that air. And as it rises, as we go up higher in the atmosphere, the air is less dense, so it's going to start to cool, and that water is going to form little rain clouds, and so you're going to start to get the rain falling here. So if we're like at the first day of spring or the first day of fall, if we are on the equator here, so let's say this is equator, so it's 0 degrees latitude of the equator. Now there's still more air warming up and coming up here. That's going to push this air that's raining up here. It's going to push it north and south. So let's just say that this is going north and this direction is going south. It's going to push that air that way. But that air is getting cooler, and because that air is getting cooler, it's going to start sinking back towards the surface. So that cooler air is being pushed back north and south from the equator because there's still more air coming up from the equator. And then as it's going back down to the Earth, now we have, when you think about air sinking, pushing on the surface of the Earth, we have a high pressure system right there. High pressure, high pressure. This air is going up away from the surface. It's going to be low pressure. Get lots of rain with low pressure. You don't get rain with high pressure. That's air high in the atmosphere pushing down. It's dry. So if we've got dry air pushing down to the surface of the Earth, we're likely to get a desert here and a desert here. And that's around 30 degrees latitude north and 30 degrees latitude south. Latitude. And just remember, latitude, when we're looking at the Earth, the equator is at 0 degrees latitude, and then it's about 30 degrees latitude north. The North Pole is at 90, and then 30 degrees latitude south. And the South Pole is at 90 south, 90 north. This is north, this is south. Now, this air that's pushing down, that is forming the desert here because it's very dry air. Now there's still more air pushing down. This is still coming up. This is still going this way. It's still pushing down. When it hits the surface, it has to go somewhere. So some of it moves back to the equator. where it heats up. And so you form this circle right here of air movement like that, going that way. And we get another circle. This will go down, go back to the equator of air movement that way. Not all the air will go back to the equator. Some of it's going to move across, and you actually form another circle over here, and some's going to go across. You're going to form another circle over there. Get those guys out of the way. Another circle over here, going in that direction. This circle of air is called a Hadley cell. This one had, whoops, I'm writing with the eraser. Hadley cell. This one here is the Hadley cell. And so the Hadley cells are going to determine where that precipitation is falling. So we have the wet area here. It's going to determine where the dry areas are. So we got a desert here and a desert here, and something kind of in between here. So you might have a tropical rainforest at the equator and then a tropical dry forest on either side of it, or savanna grasslands, tropical grasslands on either side of it, depending on the soil type. The other thing to remember, that the sun is not always directly overhead the equator. So sometimes the sun is going to be directly overhead the Tropic of Cancer or the Tropic of Capricorn, or somewhere in between that. Because of that, this location of where this rainfall is falling is going to change as the Hadley cells move further north. As the sun becomes moving towards the Tropic of Cancer, you're going to start to see the rainfall will move in that direction. And then other times of the year, the rainfall is going to be heading down towards the Tropic of Capricorn. That means the location of this rain is going to change. And if the location of this rain is going to change, some places are going to have seasonal rains in the tropics, which we call monsoons. This is a much better picture of what I was trying to draw on the last slide. This is the one out of your textbook, drawn by a professional artist. But once again, we can see at the equator here, we've got the heavy rainfall. So the air was rising at the equator. It cooled and condensed into the clouds, and then it fell in the form of rain. That air is being pushed to the north and south up high, where as it exhausts its rain, it starts to cool and it drops back down to the surface. And then when it falls down to the surface, you get the deserts forming around 30 degrees latitude north and south of the equator. And this location where this heavy rain is falling can shift to the north or south depending on where the sun is directly overhead, because the sun sometimes is going to be directly overhead further north or further south, depending on where the Earth is in its orbit around the sun. The other thing to notice here is that where these Hadley cells are located, we have wind. Sometimes the wind is going to be across the surface, and we feel those winds. And so we got winds going from where the air is going down to the desert towards the equator. And then we have other surface winds going the opposite direction, away from the equator. There's also very high winds, which airplanes are aware of as they are traveling from place to place. They're going to adjust where they're flying so that they're not flying into those headwinds. The diagram on the lower right is going to be showing you the distribution of these air circulation cells across the planet. And so here we can see at the equator, we have this Hadley cell that's going up to the north of the equator, and where it falls down, we have in northern Africa, we have the Sahara Desert being formed there. And where all that rainfall fell around the equator, we have tropical rainforest. So you can see how the biomes are going to be determined by the location of these Hadley cells. Remember that another cell would be forming further north than that. That's this cell right here. And then there's a third cell that drops down dry air straight onto the North Pole. And so the North Pole is also a desert. We get the same thing happening in the southern hemisphere. Hadley cell dropping dry air around 30 degrees south, and that is the Kalahari Desert in the southern tip of Africa. We get another Hadley cell next to that further south, and then another cell, and then a third cell that is all the way dropping dry air onto the South Pole in addition. So if we look back at our map of the biomes, we can see on that map is located the equator, which is 0 degrees latitude north. We have the Tropic of Cancer, which we now know is 23.5 degrees north, and we have the Tropic of Capricorn, which is 23.5 degrees north. They also mark in here the Arctic Circle. The Arctic Circle is 60 degrees north, and if you're above the Arctic Circle during the summertime, you can have 24 hours of sunlight because the top of the Earth is tilted towards the sun. But when we look at this and we look at the different biomes, we can take the desert biome, which is the bright yellow, and we can see a band of desert around 30 degrees north. There's deserts 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, so that we can sort of start to see a pattern in these biomes. The tropical rainforest, which is red, we can see around the tropics. We've got the tropical rainforest in South America, we've got the tropical rainforest in Africa, and then we have the tropical rainforest in Southeast Asia. If you're unfamiliar with maps as you're going through this course and we're talking about a place that you don't know where it is, take a little bit of time, look things up, figure out where things are. You should be able to identify all the continents on this map. You should be able to identify the equator, the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. You should know where the different latitudes are falling on the continents. Now, remember I said the surface winds are pretty predictable from this. If the sun is directly overhead the equator, we know we have surface winds coming, heading back towards the equator. But if you look on this particular map of where these surface winds are, we can see the surface winds are actually not going straight south to the equator, but they are tilted, and they're going from the northeast to southwest. And the same thing for the winds going back to the equator from the 30 degrees south from that Hadley cell. They're tilted. They're not going straight north back to the equator. This tilted is because the Earth is spinning underneath the air. So the air is actually going straight back, but to us it feels like it's going on an angle. And this is called the Coriolis effect. It's apparent from our perspective on the surface is a deflection of the wind. So they're deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere, and they're deflected to the left in the southern hemisphere. So if you're traveling from the desert, the Sahara Desert down to, if you're traveling from the Sahara Desert down to the equator, and the Earth is spinning beneath you, this spot that you were heading for would have already moved over, so it looks like you're traveling on an angle. We call these winds, these surface winds, the trade winds, because they were very important for people that were traveling in sailing ships during trading times. And so you can imagine that it might have been very important to understand where these winds fell and how they changed over the course of the year, depending on where the sun was directly overhead. So if you were leaving from Europe and you were going to North America, you wouldn't want to go straight across the North Atlantic. You would want to go down the coast of Africa, and that way when you went across you'd have the wind more at your back. And then if you're going back to go up here to Boston and then we go back to Europe, you'd want to stay where the wind is at your back. So understanding how these points where the wind's directions change over the course of the year was very important for when you were doing sailing ships around the world. The terrestrial biomes are predominantly determined by the plants that are associated with particular climates. So if we understand where these climates are distributed across the planet, we can understand why the biomes are found in those particular places. But it's not just average temperature and average precipitation we're interested. We also need to care about seasonally how these things change. So it's not just where the precipitation falls, but does it fall there all year? Or is there a dry season? And that's going to be important because the different plants are some are adapted to deal with a dry season and some are not to deal with a dry season. So remember when we were looking at the individual biomes dependent on the average annual temperature and average annual precipitation, we can see there were some fuzzy areas where some of these biomes overlapped each other. And that can be the influence of these other factors, which can include the seasonality of the precipitation and changes in the temperature. So we could see a boundary also between desert and tundra that if you get cold enough winter, then you're going to change what plants are going to be adapted to those very dry conditions. And you're going to move from the desert type plants to the Arctic tundra type plants. In order to understand the seasonality of temperature and precipitation, climate diagrams or climatographs or climograms, they're all the same thing. They're basically looking at over the different months what your temperature and precipitation look like. Just a reminder that remember the overlap among the different biomes says that it's not just seasonality of precipitation, and not just the average precipitation, the seasonality is important. The temperature fluctuations are important. If it gets really hot or really cold, that's going to make a difference. Soil composition, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Soils will determine how much water the can be held for the plant to use, and that's going to be based on the geology. It's also going to determine the pH of that water. And altitude, whether you're on a certain side of a mountain, a shady side, a sunny side, a side next to the ocean, a side away from the ocean, is going to influence what biome you're going to find there. So diagrams have a standard structure where we have temperature on the left vertical axis and precipitation on the right vertical axis. And they are scaled so that as the temperature increases, you're going to have on the one axis, the temperature, a 10-degree increase in temperature on that axis is going to be the same height on the graph as 20 millimeters of precipitation. And that is because for every 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, plants are going to need 20 millimeters more water in order to survive and do their photosynthesis. So you know on a hotter day, you need to water your plants more outside because on a hotter day, they are going to be having more water evaporate. So the relative position of those two lines reflect water availability. If the temperature line is above the precipitation level, then you know you don't have adequate amount of water for the plant to grow. Here we're going to plot, make our own Climograph. So what I'm going to do across the x-axis is I'm going to put the months of the year. We have January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. The way these months are put is the way we normally put the months, where you put this, the summer months are going to be in the middle of the graph. In the Southern Hemisphere, in your textbook, they will often start with, instead of starting with January, they'll start with July. So in the Southern Hemisphere, they would put July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. And so when you look at a climate diagram in your textbook, they'll all have sort of the summer area when the sun is directly overhead, that hemisphere in the middle of the graph. So pay attention to what months are down there. So on the left vertical axis, we put temperature. So we're going to have temperature in degrees Celsius on that one. And on the right one, we're going to have precipitation, which is going to be in millimeters. So we obviously, in your science class, you're using the metric system. And so a 10-degree increase in temperature is going to be associated with a 20 millimeter equivalent of precipitation. So if I'm showing my temperatures, let's say I'm starting on this axis at some place that's not going to have a cold winter. So we're going to have it starting at 0 at the bottom, 0 Celsius, the freezing point, and then we're going to have 10 degrees and 20 degrees Celsius. Well, then I would also start with 0 millimeters in precipitation, and then I would put 20 millimeters and then 40 millimeters for the same distance on the graph. So if I have in January, I have a temperature that's going to be 10 degrees in January. And if I have at the same time, if I have precipitation that is 40 millimeters, precipitation is higher than temperature, so I have more than enough rainfall for the plants to grow. So let's say I plot my temperature points throughout the year. So they get very hot in this particular place and then they start to drop. So maybe I get something that kind of looks like this for temperature. And then for this location, let's just say the rainfall is constant all year. So my rainfall goes across like this. We can see there's a certain time of the year where the rainfall line is beneath the temperature line. And so we have this period of drought where it's too hot, there's not enough rainfall for the plants to grow that time of year. So you can see at a glance that we have a drought period, whereas the rest of the year we have more than adequate amounts of rainfall. You'll also notice in the climate diagrams in your textbook, for areas where the temperature drops below freezing, plants can't grow then because the water's all frozen. They need water for photosynthesis. They need photosynthesis for growth. So if it drops below freezing, you can't get any water. The plant is unable to grow. So they will also show you in your textbook, they will actually highlight the growing season by sort of coloring in those months with a red color. And on here, I can do that with maybe with a highlighter. I'll just do it with orange so you can see. There we go. It's not really a highlighter. Well, that didn't work. That was an eraser. Here's my highlighter. There we go. I'll put my months back here. Sorry about that. So they will highlight the months that have the adequate amount of temperature for the plants to grow. And this obviously is a tropical area that has a summer drought in it where they don't have adequate rainfall. So this is probably going to end up being a tropical, because it's hot all year, but dry because of the dry season forest. Or it could even be a tropical savanna because of the dry season. Okay, this is a much nicer looking climate diagram, and basically showing you that you've got the months across the x-axis. They've highlighted the growing season months. Those growing season months that they've highlighted are when the temperature is actually above 0 Celsius, which is 0 Celsius is going to be your freezing point. So the plants cannot really grow until you get above that. When we have an area we call a temperate area, a temperate biome, we're talking about areas that have a season during the year where temperatures have dropped below the freezing point. And in this particular case, we can see that the precipitation line has fallen above. So we got the blue line is precipitation, is fallen above the line for temperature. So there's always adequate precipitation. This example shows you an area where we've got high amounts of precipitation all year, and it's got so much precipitation they have adjusted the scale. So pay attention to the scales on these diagrams in your textbook. So we're going by 20 millimeters up until we get to 100, and then that same distance now where they've got a darker shading means that they have adjusted the scale. It would have been off the top of the graph if they didn't do that. And so we can see there's high precipitation all year. We can also see that there's high temperatures. So we're looking at temperatures around 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius all year. And that is probably a tropical rainforest site. Here are two different desert sites. The top one is the hot deserts in Arizona. So we can see that it's always above freezing. We can see that the temperature never drops below freezing. So all year round, you're keeping your temperatures very hot, but there's never adequate precipitation throughout this for the plants to grow. And then the bottom one is a cold desert in Mongolia. And the cold desert in Mongolia, we can see that the temperatures drop below freezing for a certain part of the year. We've only got May through September is your growing season, which is shown at the bottom. And and though you have adequate winter precipitation, it's going to be in the form of snow. And so the only real time you're going to get growth of plants is in the early spring, is when that snow melts, and then you're going to have adequate moisture. Otherwise, the temperature line is above the precipitation line for the rest of the summer. So you'll get things growing as the snow melts and moistens the soil in the spring, but as it warms up, it's just going to be in a drought. So this is probably a desert, a cold desert, or could even be, depending on how much is grown in the spring, you might have a little bit of a very dry grassland there. So now we know that terrestrial biomes are distributed with latitude, but we don't really find very clear bands right across the world. They don't form like a perfect horizontal stripe of tropical rainforest or a perfect horizontal stripe of desert. And there are a number of other factors that are going to shape these terrestrial biomes. And we're going to talk about something like microclimate, which is how you can get quite drastic changes in temperature and precipitation by going over a very short distance. And so if you're looking at a mountain, as you go up the mountain, you're going to get cooler weather. Depending on what side of the mountain, you can have rainy sides, shady sides, cooler sides, hotter sides, and you can have different soils at different spots. So these are all going to affect what types of vegetation you find in different places. So this is section 2.2 in your textbook, other factors that shape terrestrial biomes. So this concept of microclimate is something we're going to be talking about a lot when we're talking about temperature and water relations. Microclimate, the climate right around where the organism is living, is important and is going to influence what can actually live there. Obviously, if you are in a shady spot or a sunny spot, that's going to be a very different microclimate. The presence of mountains influences temperature. As you go up in elevation, it gets much cooler, the air is thinner. Mountains also exhibit something called a rain shadow effect. A rain shadow, one side of the mountain is going to have a prevailing wind, something like these trade winds we've been talking about, that might be bringing moisture off an ocean or moisture off a lake. As the air is moving up the side of the mountain, it's going to cool and condense, and it's all going to rain on the rainy side of the mountain. And that means the leeward side, the side that's sheltered more from that wind, has dry air. It's already dumped all its rain on one side. So that lee side of the mountain is a rain shadow. So there's more moisture on the windward side and a drier climate on the leeward side. And this is a nice figure from your textbook. So here we have shown we've got evaporation of water coming up off of the ocean, or this could even be one of the Great Lakes. We've got this prevailing wind. So this might be the Pacific Ocean. The wind is coming off the Pacific Ocean. It's carrying all this moisture that's being pushed up the mountains. So as it's going up the mountains, it's going to start to cool. When it cools, it's going to form the clouds, and then the clouds are going to start raining on that side of the mountain. So then we get the rainfall occurring on the rainy side. By the time it's gone over the mountain now, it's all cooled off. When it's cooled off, the air condenses. As the air condenses, it's the dry air will then fall down the other side, and that's the rain shadow. There's the rain shadow. There's no rain in a rain shadow. So because of microclimate, when you have a lot of variation in elevation, you can find variation in the different types of vegetation that you get growing in different areas. And so this is the figure out of your textbook where you're showing the biomes in the western United States, and the biome map becomes quite complicated. So we can see that the yellow areas, which is the desert areas, we've got the Sierra Nevada mountains here, and to the right of the Sierra Nevada mountains, we've got all this desert area, and this desert area has a little bit of woodland and little bits of forest, depending on little outcroppings here and there. But for the most part, this whole area is a desert, and we've got these big mountains that are forcing the air up and over. We've got the Cascade Mountains, we've got the Sierra Nevada Mountains, and you've got a lot of rainfall on the ocean side. So over here we have the Pacific Ocean. We have lots of rainfall as the air is forced up over those mountains, and then it's all dry. So when you go past those mountains and the air continues to blow in this direction, so you've got the westerly trade winds, you really have run out of moisture and you end up with a desert biome. When we look at the climographs for the US, then you can see that if we just look at average precipitation and average temperature, this is sort of like the figure we saw before. We've got the temperature going up the y-axis here, and we've got the precipitation going across the x-axis, which is a little different than what we had seen before. But we can see a lot of overlap then in these biomes, and this can be in part due to effects of having the same temperatures, the same precipitation, but you're changing, in some cases, elevation. You could be on the rain shadow of something, or it could be also differences in soil type. Just a quick introduction to soil. You can take entire courses in soil, and learn about all the different types of soils and the different layers in the soil. So this is just a very simple overview, and we're looking at soil being a mixture of the minerals. We've got the non-living materials. We've got the sand, the silt, the clay, the gravel, the stones in the soil. But we also have living things in the soil. We have organic material. We've got worms. We've got insect larvae. We've got moles. So it's a mixture of living and non-living material making up the soil. Soil is not sterile. It's full of bacteria, full of fungus, full of living organisms. The classification of soil is based on the vertical layers, which are called soil horizons. When you're talking about a vertical layer, we mean as we go down vertically, you find different soil types, but they are all parallel to the soil horizon. So as we go down from the surface, down deeper, we find changes in the soil, and those are your soil horizons. So when you look at a soil, you dig down in a soil, soil's always changing. Animals are moving it around. The rainfall is going to be different at different times of the year. You're seeing a snapshot of what that soil looks like at that time. The different layers, the thickness of the layers, whether a layer even exists or not, is going to depend on the climate and the underlying rock material, the geology in an area. You might have an organic layer on the top, which is just all your leaves that have fallen, dead organisms. So this is just the most superficial, the top layer of your soil. When things start to decompose, that gets mixed in with the sand, the silt, the clay, the gravel, and you get what is called a horizon. As it rains, it's going to wash nutrients from that A horizon down deeper into the soil. And you're going to find the smaller particles like clay being moved down from the A horizon into the B horizon. Because so many nutrients move down here and the water moves down here, plants like to get their roots down there. It's a much more stable condition for getting nutrients and roots and water. And then you get deep enough, especially if you're living in New Jersey, you start digging even deeper, you're probably going to find some sand, or depending on where you live, you might find gravel, bits of rock. This is the underlying geology, the underlying parent material that the soil was built from. So here's a typical soil profile. We can see the organic horizon on the top where we have all the litter material. Beneath that, we can see that we are getting material leached into that. It starts to mix in. We get material deposited down in this B horizon, and you can see these trees are getting their roots down there. There's lots of water, there's less evaporation, and lots of nutrients down there. And then down here in the C horizon, we can see whatever this underlying bedrock is breaking apart, it's weathering, and it's being incorporated into the soil. So that's where your minerals are coming from. If you flip back in your chapter, or if you're online, you go to the applications section of your chapter, which is right at the very end. It's after section 2.3, but it's before the summary and review questions. There's an application called Finer Climatic Variation over Time and Space. And it is talking a little bit more about microclimate and talking about temporal changes as well. So we get very fine scale changes in the weather and in the climate, and they introduced the concept of the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is used to characterize climatic variation. And it's been historically used by farmers to indicate drought conditions. It will also tell you about wet conditions. And a drought is defined as an extended period of dry weather where the precipitation has been reduced sufficiently that it's going to damage the crops. And so that can help, that can sort of hurt the ecosystems. It can also cause water shortages for people. And right now, we have had so many years of drought in the American Southwest that it has been categorized as a mega drought because it's been so many years of drought. So climate diagrams, remember we're looking at average temperature, average precipitation. So that's long-term averages or a long period of time. But often we can find these variations that show that things can be for a period of time quite different from average. And we'll find later when we're talking about some, well, we'll use an example of Galapagos finches, where there's certain years where they had more rainfall and less rainfall, and how that impacts their populations. So some regions are climatically more stable, and other regions are climatically more variable than others. And regions that are under the influence of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is the shifting of the ocean patterns so that the ocean currents are instead of going away from South America west across the Pacific, shift go east across the Pacific. When we get an El Nino, that's going to change your precipitation and your temperature patterns in areas that are affected by that very significantly. The example they show in your textbook is looking at the Palmer Drought Index, which is how we measure, one way of measuring drought severity. And this is from the NOAA data. And this is showing you that some areas can experience significant droughts. And so we know about the droughts in California causing a lot of fires. When you have an extreme drought, you obviously are going to have increased fire risks. Other areas, though, at the same time could be having more moisture falling than expected. Excuse me. So we can also see over the years and over time, we can see across the bottom of this graph, we can find not only do we find changes from state to state and county to county across the country. But over time, when you're looking at a particular area, and this is looking, I believe, at the area around Manhattan, Kansas, we can see that some periods of time you get years where you have drought, and then we have periods of years where we have additional rainfall. So one single location can get one or the other. The bulk of this chapter is found in section 2.3, the natural history and geography of biomes, in which we go through each biome individually. I'm just going to introduce the concept, but I'm not going to go into detail. I'm saving that for the next presentation. But we now know that environmental conditions will influence what plants and animals are able to function within that particular area. So the biology of the biome will be determined by that. We used to be very interested in biomes. We studied how everything worked together in a very positive way in the early the early 20th century then, and then we became much more interested in how things don't work together, how things impact each other in other ways, and sort of turned away from the study of biomes. Though there are some places where the researchers, where the ecologists are still working very hard on understanding biomes. Now with global warming, we are finding that the biomes are changing, they're moving, things are adjusting, and so there's a renewed interest in understanding the biomes. And they talk about some of the work by Osvaldo Sala, who has worked on a model for trying to predict which biomes are more vulnerable to changes in climate. And those biomes are the grassland biomes and the Mediterranean woodland biomes. In general, we find that the desert biome's not likely to change much in the coming future with climate change. If anything, the deserts are more likely to expand than disappear. I guess that is changing in a way. So looking at where the biomes are found, then we can see these general patterns we've been talking about. We can see the influence of the mountains on the patterns.
Biomes are major communities of organisms that have a characteristic appearance and are distributed over a wide area defined largely by vegetation and regional variations in climate. Ecologists recognize between 8 and 14 major categories of biomes. The most commonly used terms to identify biomes include tropical rainforest, savanna, desert, temperate grassland, temperate deciduous forest, temperate evergreen forest, taiga, and tundra. Moisture and temperature are key environmental factors in determining which biomes are found where. Tropical rainforests receive 140 to 450 centimeters of rain per year and contain at least half of the Earth's species of plants and animals. The soil in tropical rainforests is not nutrient-rich. Most of the nutrients are held in the plants. Savannas are grasslands that border the tropics and receive 75 to 125 centimeters of rain per year. This environment is characterized by alternating rainy and dry seasons. Savannas are often inhabited by huge herds of grazing animals that migrate in response to the seasons. Deserts receive less than 25 centimeters of rain per year. Vegetation is sparse, and survival depends on water conservation. Temperate grasslands are found halfway between the equator and the poles. These temperate regions are characterized by fertile soil. Temperate deciduous forests occur in regions with warm summers, cool winters, and plenty of rain. Dominant species of trees include oak, maple, ash, and hickory. Temperate evergreen forests occur in regions where winters are cold and there is a strong seasonal dry period. The taiga consists of a great ring of northern forests consisting of coniferous trees. This ecosystem is one of the largest on Earth, with long, cold winters and most of the limited precipitation falling in the summer. In the far north, above the taiga, few trees grow. The grassland, called tundra, is open, windswept, and often boggy. Trees are small and confined to regions near lakes and streams. Large grazing animals, including reindeer and caribou, as well as carnivores, such as wolves and foxes, live in these areas.
Biomes will be gone through in detail, including their diagrams in the second presentation, so that introduction will just give you a feel for overall what we're talking about. So homework, make sure that you have reviewed the sections in the chapter, temperature, atmospheric circulation, precipitation. It describes the climate diagrams and the other chapter factors that shaped biomes. So we talked about the rain shadow effect, and we talked about soil, and then the finer scale variation when we're talking about the Palmer Drought Index. The terrestrial biomes will be in the next presentation. Uh, you want to be looking at your concept review questions. So for the first section of the chapter, there were two questions. How would seasonality and temperature and precipitation be affected if Earth's rotation on its axis were perpendicular to its plane of orbit around the sun? So if it was at 90 degrees instead of moved off by 23.5 degrees. The second concept review question for the first section of the chapter was, why does the annual rainy season in regions near 23 degrees north latitude begin in June? So remember to think about the movement of those Hadley cells. For the second concept review section, it was asking a question about soils. The organic horizon is generally absent from agricultural soils because of tilling or plowing, and that buries your organic matter. Why is an organic horizon generally absent from desert soils? So think about what makes the organic layer in a soil and why that might be missing from the desert soil. Concept review section 2.3, that's going to be that section is going to be covered in the next PowerPoint. But while you're going through that presentation, think about why do those regions, whether tropical, desert, or temperate, that include high mountains, tend to be the most biologically diverse. And why would the soils in tropical rainforests generally be depleted of their nutrients more rapidly compared to the nutrients in temperate forest soils? We covered that a little bit in chapter 1 as well. So it's pulling back information from previous chapters, and the course builds on the information from previous chapters. You can't forget what you already learned when you're moving through. At the end of the chapter, you will find review questions, you'll find vocabulary, you'll find key terms that you want to make sure, and there's also a summary. Make sure you can answer all the review questions at the end of this chapter. Also, when you flip back or when you move back to the Appendix A in your textbook, and there's a link to Appendix A in our e-learning, you're going to want to read the investigating the evidence number 2, determining the sample mean. So this is what we mean by an average. This is how you calculate an average. We've talked about average temperature, average precipitation. So you should understand the concept of an average. And then there's 2 little questions that you should be able to answer, and critiquing the evidence too. So make sure you can do those as well. When you're reading ahead in your book, we're going to be moving on. The next one in this series is going to be on chapter 5. So after I have finish the biome for chapter 2, look ahead to chapter 5. It's on temperature relations, and you can start looking at the concept review questions in that chapter, and also the investigating the evidence number 5, which is dealing with the concept of lab experiments, and it has a couple questions there. So if you want to learn about the individual biomes, then that will be the next presentation, and I'll see you there. Bye.